So you heard me say obedience before. It's not really a word that we like to use very often, is it? For some reason, we kind of have a slightly negative thought around this word, obedience or disobedience. What thoughts come to your mind, perhaps, when I say that word? And I've got to admit that in this age where we're told that you can just do whatever you want, if it feels good, that's probably the right direction you should go. Obedience isn't really something that we talk about very often. We're always told to strive for pleasure and for comfort. Relaxed and comfortable, I believe, one of our former prime ministers used once when he described what he would like us to be. It's just not a topic, I think, that's very high on our list. Obedience seems more like a topic for kids and teens, perhaps, than it does for adults, right? Well, today being Father's Day, I thought I could easily come up with an example, an illustration about obedience. And I had two ways to go. I could either pick an example of my own father and perhaps my obedience or lack of it with him, or I could go with my own kids and their obedience factor with me. So, I'm just thinking, which way would you like me to go this morning? Mike's pointing to Natasha. So, no. I would never do that. So you're off the hook, girls. But when I was about 12 or 13, seems like I'm always confessing something about my life these days. Yeah. Do you know what it's like when you're about that age and your parents go out, right? And you have the house to yourself. So my older siblings were often out as well. And Jared was 6 years younger than me, so he'd be either with my parents or maybe in bed if it was nighttime. When you got the house to yourself at night, something strange happens to you. You just feel like a king. And you own the place. And you can take whatever you want from the fridge and the pantry and play music at whatever volume you see fit. The neighbours won't mind. And you generally feel pretty good about yourself when you're doing that. Now, there was always one thing, though. When Mum and Dad went out at night, if I was by myself, Nathan, you're only 12, 13, whatever it was back then, got to put yourself to bed. Say 9:30 would be your limit. Okay, I can do that. But I didn't, right? And so what would often happen is, and the good thing about being by yourself is you got the choice of what you can watch on TV. You can just take advantage of this situation. And so my thing was I'd stay up and watch TV even though I wasn't supposed to. And it was easy to do, right? Because you could hear Mum and Dad coming up the driveway, and we did have the noisiest garage door in the street, right? So you had plenty of warning, TV off, into bed, pretend you were asleep. No problem at all. Now, it seemed like a good plan, but for some reason, Dad knew. He knew. He would always say, I know you've been up watching TV. And I tried to deny it, and he said, no, you can't deny it. I know. And I could never work out why. And then one day, he filled me in. And it was so obvious. All he had to do was place his hand on the TV. And if it was hot, you're caught. But he didn't tell me that little trick for some time. But I was found out. There was a king. He tried to pull a similar act of disobedience and then cover it up like I did in the Old Testament. And if you've been with us for the last few weeks, we've been in 1 Samuel. I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I have. And I had someone say to me this week, I hear you keep saying that it's good and that you're enjoying it, so I decided to read all the in-between bits. And I want to encourage you to do that, to read 1 Samuel, all the bits that I'm not covering. But we started right back at the beginning, started with Hannah. You remember that? And then we had Samuel once when he was young and he had to hear God's voice. And then the second time was, when he had to call Saul, right, to be king. And Saul was from the smallest tribe and the smallest clan, and he wasn't a very well-known person. So that was the first 10 chapters of 1 Samuel. in chapters 11, 12, and 13, and 14 actually. It deals with Saul and his time as king, and there's a lot of military exploits in these chapters, and I invite you to read them sometime because I'm not going to cover much of it today. Sadly, in these 4 chapters, though, we do discover a bit of an attitude that Saul had to obeying God. Twice he got himself into trouble by making poor decisions, and one of those he was blatantly disobedient. He gave the sacrifice when he was supposed to be waiting for Samuel, and then he does that, and then Samuel literally walks around the corner, bing, and gets busted, and he just did that in blatant disobedience to God. In chapter 13, it says that Saul reigned for 42 years. If you didn't know that, he was 30 when he first became king. That means he was 72 when he sadly ended his reign, and he ended his life as well. Before that, before the end of his life, there was this moment in chapter 15, though, where he just took this disobedience one step too far. It didn't mean at this time, though, that his earthly rule ended over Israel. It did mean, though, that God removed his anointing from Saul, and his call shifted then to another person who would be Israel's best king. Let me just quickly summarize what happens here. So Samuel brings instruction to Saul from God. He says, you got to go and make war on the Amalekites. And it's to punish them for what they did originally when the nation came up out of Egypt. And the Amalekites attacked them. You can actually read about it back in Exodus. I think it's chapter 17 or something like that. But these Amalekites, they were particularly wicked people. In fact, some modern scholars have likened them to modern-day terrorists. They specialised in preying on weaker opponents, and they were always taking advantage of others for their own gain. They were also known to sacrifice children to pagan gods, and they were actually just this constant threat to Israel. You can read about it, like I said, in Exodus 17. So Samuel gives Saul these very clear instructions of what he must do. And they are essentially this, that Israel, or Saul, has to take this whole group of people out. And when I say take them out, it means everything. It means livestock. And it actually says in the word, you can read it in the beginning of chapter 15, women and children. Everything that's breathing must be destroyed. And I got to admit, I was ready to preach a bit further down. I'm going to do that in a minute, and I thought, I'll just gloss over this bit. I didn't really want to speak about it because the truth is I do struggle a little bit. It's shocking to me to read that this God that I actually know, who's so full of love and compassion and mercy, would order Saul to commit genocide. And yet, it's there in our Bible. And there's probably many others that would explain this to you better than me, but I'm just going to give you a few thoughts before we move on. And it's this. We don't fully understand why God would command such a thing, but we do trust God that He is just. And we have to recognize that we are incapable of fully understanding how fully understanding a sovereign, infinite, and eternal God. As we look at different issues such as this one, we have to remember that God's ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. We have to be willing to trust God and have faith in Him even when we don't understand His ways. Now, unlike us, God actually knows the future. God knew what the results would be if Israel did not completely eradicate the Amalekites at this time. If they didn't follow out His orders, they'd come back and they'd constantly be trouble. In fact, this is what happens. David has to deal with them later on because Saul didn't necessarily do it the right way. And in a similar way that God brought a flood and He just destroyed 2 cities, He opened up the earth at Mount Sinai and He sent a whole nation into exile. God's judgment for rebellion can be exacted as he, in his sovereign power, over the universe that he created, sees fit to do. And in this particular circumstance, as the direct king over Israel, it's his people that were his instrument for justice in this point. I think we need to remember that this world is not our world, it's God's world. And he doesn't really owe us an explanation when our neatly packaged theology doesn't quite fit what we read. He knows what's best, and I'm willing to trust that this was the appropriate action at this particular time and with these peoples and for reasons that I may never understand. And I'm glad that we live today because we're not Israel. We're not a nation, we're not a political entity, we are the church. And the command that Jesus gave the church was to spread the gospel by loving your enemy, by praying for those who persecute us, to lay down our life for God and his purpose. It's not to kill, to spread the gospel, as some other religions try to do. In fact, it's the complete opposite. And it's the total opposite. We're called to die to spread the gospel in the same way that Jesus did. It's probably as deep as I can get on that particular topic. But I did want to touch on it to you today from your pastor. I can't avoid the tough bits, right? And so I needed to just mention that. If you got some extra thoughts on that, you're welcome to come and talk to me because there might be some better theological reflection on that particular part. But let's pick up today's passage. We're going to be in verse 7 of chapter 15. You can follow on the screen behind if you wish. It says, Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me, and he has not carried out my instructions. Then Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up, and he went to meet Saul, but he was told Saul's gone to Carmel. He has set up a monument in his own honor. That was good of Saul to do, and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. When Samuel finally reached Saul, he said, this is what Saul said, Oh, the Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. Isn't that great of Saul? Real lovely greeting that he gave to Samuel. I can just hear it in his voice, real cheerful as he greeted Samuel. Because I think he probably thought he'd got away with it, with his disobedience. But now comes the hand on the back of the TV moment from Samuel. In verse 14, Samuel says, Well, what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? And what is this lowing of cattle that I hear? And says, Saul is caught. And the evidence of his disobedience is obvious. And so here's what Saul said in reply. The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But don't worry, we totally destroyed the rest. Already he's trying to blame somebody else. Well, enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. You must wage war against them until you've wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God. in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And then Samuel says this, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. My first point to you today, church, is that partial obedience is disobedience made to look acceptable. And God commands us to do something either through his commandments in the Bible, or if he gives you some kind of personal revelation. Nothing but complete follow-through is considered to be obedience. We can be so good at only doing half or part of what God tells us to do. We do just a bit of it, and then we think we're being obedient. But partial obedience is disobedience. So if you hear from God and he says, be generous to someone, then be generous. Be wholeheartedly generous in obedience to God. When God is telling us someone's in trouble, help them properly. When God brings you an opportunity to share about the love of Jesus to someone, don't neglect it. Be obedient and share. When God calls you to be fully involved in the mission of the church, then get fully involved. And if you've got a family, then parents, take your family into that involvement in the church. Get them fully involved, the whole family. The church is the bride of Christ, and Christ died for the church. So parents, let's make sure our children are learning to love and respect the church the same way Christ did. And since this is Father's Day, I want to encourage you men to fully consider your role in raising your children in the ways of Jesus. If you're married, this is something you do in partnership. And yet I'm sorry to say, I've seen fathers who sometimes neglect this role and they just leave it to their wives to do. I'm just saying, you both have this job. In fact, Paul even mentions it in Ephesians, when he said, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Raising your kids in the ways of the Lord is not something that you leave others to do. We don't leave it to the kids' zone leaders, and we don't leave it to the teachers in the Christian schools. It's something that we do. Now, if you're unsure how to do that, I know sometimes it can be a little awkward, perhaps, and you don't know how to talk about God to your kids. I encourage you to give it a go, and I bet you'll be pleasantly surprised and blessed just how interested your kids are to hear about God from their father. Ask them what they've learnt in Kids Zone or even their tribe time at youth. Don't be afraid to engage them about culture and faith, because if you don't, someone else will. Demonstrate to your kids your own devotional life. I just want to say this. It's okay to do your devotions where your kids can see you. Your kids watch everything you do and say. In fact, I know recently when I started doing my devotions in my bedroom, I used to always do it at my dining room table over breakfast. And the other day, even one of my family members said to me, are you still doing daily devotions, Dad? And so I'm just saying, it's okay to do it out there where your kids can see you. They watch everything you do. I encourage you, reflect Christ to your children. The point, though, is not to neglect God's commands to you. Don't do partial, half-hearted obedience and pass it off as obedience. Let's go to verse 24. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. You know, he's close with this moment. But he doesn't quite get there still. He's still pointing to other people, and he's not owning it fully himself. It doesn't matter what his men told him. He had the clear instructions from God and didn't follow. So point 2, don't fall into the trap of blaming others for your disobedience. And you know what? If you're like me, we can become experts at this. It actually goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. There's always someone else's fault. We don't want to be completely guilty if there's a way to direct some blame towards someone else, perhaps. I've done this. As I sat and reflected on this sermon, I think about the times when perhaps I've done the wrong thing and admitted it, but then deflected a little bit of that. But what about what such and such did? And, you say, you can't fully blame me for what happened. I'm not going to take the full fall for this. And we do this as people, as humans. When God convicts us, it's time to fully accept responsibility for our disobedience. That's how you confess and repent. Don't blame anyone else. Just look at your own heart. Saul shows us exactly what not to do. He pretended that he did the right thing and he shared some blame on the men. He even went as far as trying to pronounce how righteous he was to keep the best animals because it was all about sacrificing to God. But unfortunately, it was self-serving. And this is the problem. Sacrifice to God is important. In fact, we're called to. But it's unacceptable if your motives are wrong and you're not submitting to his will. In fact, sacrifice is essential in our walk with the Lord, but when we don't do it out of devotion and a pure heart, we're in trouble. And I just want to encourage us, when we come into church, we bring a sacrifice of praise. Let's do it wholeheartedly and with a pure heart. And sadly for Paul, this was the beginning of the end for him. And it's the day his partnership with God and with Samuel ended. And in verse 26, it goes on to say, Samuel said, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe and it tore, and Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind. So you see, disobedience, it's got consequences. In the end, God rejected Saul's kingship because Saul had continually disobeyed and rejected God. And when we consider this topic of disobedience, it's easy just to stop at those consequences, but it's also important for us to consider the opposite of disobedience, and that's obedience. And obedience is actually a positive word, okay? I started off this message saying that we don't like to use the word obedience. It reminds us too much of teenagers and children and all the things that we have to do and all the laws we have to follow. But I'm telling you today that obedience is positive. It's a good thing. And it's my final point today, and that's this. Our obedience actually brings great delight to God. Remember back in verse 22 when Samuel said, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? The answer was, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. See, Samuel was pointing out God's delight in our sacrifice, but even more so, his delight in our obedience. So here's a few thoughts I've got on why he would be delighted with our obedience. And the first one is this: because our obedience actually reflects the perfect nature of God to the world. As his ambassadors, as Christ followers, when we obey, that actually reflects God to the world. And he delights in that. The second one is it shows that God's grace is a glorious power. God delights in obedience because it shows that God's grace is a power that has a spiritual outcome and is not just some flimsy tolerance of sin. The power of God's grace is seen not just in the fact that God forgives the sin of believers, but also in the fact that it gradually and it finally and victoriously eradicates those sins. And if God did not delight in our obedience, God's grace might never be seen in its sin-conquering power. I hope you can see what I mean here. If God didn't delight in our obedience or despair in our disobedience, then his grace loses its significance. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Its power, the power of grace, can be reduced. If you're struggling with this point, try it this way. If God didn't care about your obedience, the amazing grace we sing about is not amazing. But because obedience is so important to him, above even sacrifice, the grace he gives us for our disobedience is amazing. The third one was, it's because he loves and desires the best for us. He loves us and desires the best for us. Everything God commands for us is for our good. Did you hear that bit? Everything God commands us to do is for our good. And so what God is really delighting is when in our obedience we have this lasting joy that comes, and he delights in our joy. Because it's good for us, it brings joy to us, and because we have joy, he delights in obedience. Our God delights in our deep and lasting joy. He knows what's good for you. The obedience he loves is the obedience of faith. Our obedience does not have to be perfect. It just has to be wholehearted. He doesn't need us to be obedient just to fill some kind of ego. He doesn't actually need us at all, but he desires us and he loves us. He's a good, good father, just as we were singing earlier. Obedience is a desire in our hearts to live for our God who died for us. Andrew Murray's got this great quote that says, "Beware of praying only for a blessing. Let us seek first obedience, and God will supply the blessing." Our constant question as a Christian should be, how can I obey and please God perfectly? Okay, Chloe and the team, if you want to join me. So if you're my age or older, then you might be familiar with a great musician by the name of Keith Green. Who knows that name? Yeah, it was my age and older. He was popular in the 70s and 80s. Tragically, he died in a plane accident. You know, Keith was like a modern day prophet. Do you remember some of his songs of the times? I think he was a prophet sent to the Western world, the Christian world. And his words would sometimes sting. But someone had to do it. He wrote a song based on this passage. It's called To Obey is Better Than Sacrifice. And I'm going to sing it for you now. No, I'm not. Just joking. It would destroy the power of the song. Here's the words. To obey is better than sacrifice. I don't need your money. I want your life. I hear you say that I'm coming back soon, but you act like I'll never return. Well, you speak of grace and my love so sweet, how you thrive on milk, but you reject my meat. I can't help weeping of how it will be if you keep on ignoring my words. Well, you pray to prosper and succeed, but your flesh is something I just can't feed. To obey is better than sacrifice. I want more than Sunday and Wednesday nights. Because if you don't come to me every day, then why do you bother coming at all? To obey is better than sacrifice. I want hearts of fire, not your prayers of ice. And I'm coming back quickly. This morning as we come to God's table, we remember how deep the Father's love is for us today. God is calling you to obedience, but I just want to say He's calling you lovingly to obedience. He hasn't got the big stick out. Did you ever grow up in primary school when the teacher had the big long ruler with the T-piece on the end? And man, they could slam that thing on your table so fast and hard. It scared the life out of me. God's lovingly calling you to obedience. So I invite you to spend a couple of minutes in prayer. Look, this morning, if you need to confess and repent, then the Lord's table is a good place for you to do that. You need to consider, where is God calling you to obedience? Where is He calling us as a church to obedience? I've been reflecting on that this week. It's here at the Lord's table that there's an outpouring of God's grace into us. If you're willing to receive it as you remember the love He showed for you by laying down His life while we were still sinners, then this morning you come and you receive